Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. It's always great to see so many familiar names, if not faces, in these Title IX Team Meetup webinars. I am Jackie Godapur-Werns, and I am joined today by my colleagues from Franczek. We have Emily Tulloch, Kendra Yock, and Amy Dickerson. So today our plan was to talk to you about Title IX under Biden, and we didn't really know what we were going to be talking about when we set this as our topic about a month ago, but there have been some interesting changes, so we're going to talk through those. But as we expected, little things like the coronavirus and immigration and an impeachment trial have been really taking the forefront in Washington in the past, 10, 11, 12 days since inauguration. So there hasn't really been a ton of change. So a lot of what we are going to be talking about today is going to be a little bit of reading the tea leaves. But if you have questions, we would love to hear them. We definitely envision these meetups as an opportunity for you to have a place to ask questions. You can always submit your questions anonymously using the Q&A. You also can submit your questions in the chat, whatever's easiest for you. We're a relatively small group, so please, if there's anything that you've been thinking about, even if it doesn't have anything to do with the Biden administration, feel free, Title IX free for all, ask us anything. So with that, let's jump in, and we were going to start with really the most concrete action that we've had, which was is some new guidance that we received from the Biden administration very quickly with respect to the rights of transgender students. And so that is directly applicable to Title IX. The question of what are transgender student rights under Title IX. And I figure, Amy, why don't we start out with just a kind of a background of what the history is of this issue under Title IX.
Yeah, sure. So, we know that under the Obama administration, he and his administration really robustly enforced rights for transgender students in schools, from protection against discrimination to ensuring that they had access to bathrooms and other facilities of their choice. Then under the Trump administration, we saw a swing in the opposite direction. Trump, withdrew the guidelines issued by the Obama administration that set out all of those protections, and which had also said that Title IX applied to gender identity, not just gender. What we saw too as well under the Trump administration, one of the big issues, with respect to athletics and the rights of transgender students. And under President Trump, OCR had threatened to take away federal funding from certain public high schools, and an athletic association in Connecticut that we had seen for allowing quote unquote biologically male transgender female students to compete on girls athletic teams, which found that OCR found violates the Title IX rights of the cisgender female students on the teams. Now, we did see in August 2020, the Trump administration for the first time recognized that LGBTQ discrimination and harassment is generally covered by Title IX. But it said that because Title IX and its implementing regulations may in some cases require consideration of a person's biological sex, such as when using facilities in a school building or assigning students to sports teams, that it would not consider different treatment based on gender identity in those instances to be discrimination based on sex. Now, under the Biden administration, we see President Biden taking a much broader view of it. And as a result, we do expect that Title IX, the position of the administration will be that Title IX covers everything with respect to the rights for LGBTQ students, including restrooms, locker rooms, and sports. Now, with that in mind, Jackie, the Biden administration hasn't yet actually come out explicitly with a position on the issues of restrooms, locker rooms, athletic teams, right?
Right. So again, this is a little bit of our first bit of tea leaf reading. And so we don't know for sure what approach that the Biden administration is taking with respect to locker rooms, athletic teams, and restrooms. But what we know is that an executive order was issued on the first day of Biden's administration that said that a recent decision that addressed Title VII, so that addressed the sort of sister law to Title IX that applies in the employment context. In that case from the U.S. Supreme Court, it said that discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation is, sex discrimination. And so what we saw from the Biden team is in this executive order was a statement that basically that decision, Bostock, that decision applies equally in the case of other laws that prohibit sex discrimination, including Title IX. And so it did include like a little caveat of so long as the relevant laws don't contain sufficient indications to the contrary. And so that does leave a little bit of room for the argument that the Trump administration was making, which is that Title IX is a little bit different than Title VII. That's what the Trump administration has been arguing, is that, with Title IX, with the fact that the Title IX law was actually created to give female students access to athletics, for example, that there could be other considerations that would come into play that wouldn't be an issue in an employment decision. And so, yes, there's a little bit of room there, but if you look at how, and Amy, you described this, but if you look at how the Obama administration handled Title IX and handle matters involving transgender students, that's what makes me think we're going to be headed back to the same interpretation that we had back then.
And I'm just thinking, this kind of swinging back and forth from administration to administration and how we interpret Title IX and what does it mean. Do you guys think we're going to see congressional action, court action that's directly on point so we can finally kind of settle this and have some consistency in how schools should be handling these issues?
I hope so. I mean, I'll tell you, I know that ATICSA, the Association for Title IX Administrators, has started working groups, and they went out for people to volunteer for those working groups. And so I'm going to be working on the working group that is policies and procedures. And they are actually, their goal is to try to push legislation for the very reason that you mentioned, which is that legislation, it doesn't just change when a new administration comes in. It requires a lot more consensus. And so hopefully we would get something that would stick, because man, this back and forth is just, it's a nightmare for everyone. It's a nightmare for the poor OCR attorneys, my former colleagues, to have to switch gears and completely interpret things differently. But it's also a nightmare for our clients who are having to try to figure out how to live under these rules.
Well, and I think we'll talk about this too. And we've been talking about, what do we expect in terms of the approach that the Biden administration will take when it comes to the Title IX regulations. And maybe we'll see a, short-term, long-term approach and, a legislative push there, at some point, either in between or one of those approaches for those very reasons.
Right. All right. So another somewhat concrete change or news in this area is that we have an acting assistant secretary for the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. So this is the position that Kenneth Marcus was just vacated under Donald Trump. It is the person who is the head of OCR. So they really are a person who sets the direction of the agency as far as enforcing civil rights, including Title IX. And so the Biden administration has appointed Suzanne Goldberg, who is a Columbia University law professor and also held an administrative position in the Equity and Title IX Civil Rights Department within Columbia. So she is a former, coming straight out of a role as a Title IX administrator in the higher education space. So that is very interesting. I personally, what my immediate thought was when I saw this was this is going to be good for institutions because she's from a school. She's from within an institution that was responding to civil rights complaints. And that is just going to be something I think that will be positive as far as her having an understanding of what your jobs are actually like, as opposed to being having a different position, a different background.
Yeah, Jackie, I think that's really interesting too, because if you kind of look back at some of the most recent secretaries or acting secretaries of OCR, a lot of them have that really in-depth educational background that's really from an advocacy perspective. So if you look at, for example, Ruslan Ali, who was the assistant secretary under Obama, she served as the vice president of the Education Trust in Washington, D.C., and was also the founding executive director of the Education Trust in Oakland, California, before she served at OCR. Catherine Lehman was the director of impact litigation at Public Counsel, which is one of the biggest nonprofit pro bono law firms in the nation. Candace Jackson was primarily engaged in a private legal practice, and then Ken Marcus had also served as the Equality and Justice in America chair at Baruch College and also founded the Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. So we really see, throughout the last several secretaries or assistant secretaries, this real background in advocacy and education advocacy.
Yeah, and interestingly, the new appointee kind of has a mix of both, right? She's been at Columbia Law for a while in this position as a Title IX administrator, but prior to that, she spent a few decades at Lambda Legal, which is an advocacy organization for LGBTQ people. When she was there, she worked on several landmark cases, including one that helped to establish the right to asylum protection for LGBTQ people who are facing persecution in their home countries. She was also involved in securing rights for people who are in domestic partnerships, like be able to access your spouse's healthcare through their employer. So she has that advocacy piece too in her history. Then when she was at Columbia, in addition to her other roles, she was co-director of the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law and created a law clinic. So the clinic is something that happens in law schools that helps train law students on how to actually practice law and make arguments, write briefs and things like that. And they're really focused in this particular clinic on advocating for the rights and inclusion of LGBTQ people. So this background kind of gives us a glimpse into her, yes, she has the institutional side, she also has the advocacy side, and certainly gives us an idea of where she's going to fall on how we interpret Title IX with respect to LGBTQ people.
Yeah, one thing I thought that was really interesting, just reading about what initial reactions were to her appointment, is that a lot of survivors of sexual assault, and particularly those who come from the Columbia University community, were concerned about her commitment to revisiting and really revamping the Title IX regulations, putting back into place a process that looked more like something under President Obama. And a lot of folks said, we don't really feel that we were well served by her when she was in this role at Columbia University. So there's definitely some conflicting feelings about her appointment. I would say my biggest disappointment, it's not really a disappointment, but just the fact that someone from the higher education space who hasn't had any experience in the K-12 space, at least not directly, it makes me sad, because obviously we do a lot of work with K-12 institutions on Title IX, and I would love for there to be some folks who really understand the challenges that you all face that are very, very different than the challenges in the higher education space. And I'm not sure we're going to get that from her, but hopefully there are other people who are, particularly because remember, even though she's the head of OCR, we are somewhere within the education department, there is a group of people who are working on Title IX, the Title IX regulations. And we're hopeful that that group is going to include some robust experience from the K-12 space.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's talk about another executive order that Biden has already signed. There was one on the topic of equity more generally. So Jackie, do you want to kind of jump in and give us an introduction?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to start out by saying we recognize that this executive order, it doesn't directly relate to Title IX, yet you may have noticed if you follow our Title IX Insights blog, we did blog about it, and because we do think that it will have some, trickle down effects. So we do think that this executive order, even though it deals with equity more generally, that it is helpful for us as we're doing that reading the tea leaves exercise that we were talking about that we're going to be doing today. So Emily, do you want to jump in and give us a little bit of background on it?
Yeah, so the reason we kind of find this so relevant to the Title IX space is that Trump had previously issued an executive order, titled "Combating Offensive and Anti-American Race and Sex Stereotyping and Scapegoating," which is pretty strong language by federal contractors and recipients of federal funds, and that includes schools, colleges, and universities. So really what the order ended up doing was banning any racial and sex stereotype and sensitivity trainings for employees of federal contractors, students, and recipients of federal grant funds. So, if the trainings included anything that had to do with systemic racism and sexism, implicit bias, or other, common and similar topics, schools that received those federal funds were really at risk of losing federal funding. Schools that endorse these topics in their curriculum were also at risk of losing federal funds. And just broadly, the order also gave a lot of support to legal challenges under Title VII, that sister law that Jackie and Amy were talking about, against employers that provided race and sensitivity trainings that included, what the order termed divisive concepts. And again, that's implicit bias, systemic racism, and sexism as kind of a background for why we kind of think these new executive orders might kind of come into play here.
Right. So this order was signed, I think, on Biden's first day, and it rescinds the Trump order entirely. That order had certainly been very controversial and criticized, as censorship and, potentially contrary to the First Amendment. And so this, does away with that order entirely, but it does go farther and requires all agencies across the federal government to prioritize equity and create opportunities for communities that have been historically underserved. The Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, is supposed to be working directly with agency leaders to identify best practices and how to embed equity principles and policies across the federal government, including removing systemic barriers to equal access. And I think it's relevant here because the order, it does list out the particular groups or demographics that are included, and it calls out specifically gender identity and sexual orientation. So that gives us a little bit further insight into sort of where this administration is going on these topics.
Right, and I think between these two orders, if I'm an OCR attorney, I'm probably thinking, like, even if there hasn't been direct guidance to say so, I'm thinking, okay, we are robustly enforcing transgender LGBTQ rights under this administration. But I will tell you, so we received a lot of calls after we published our alert on the Trump executive order on equity, and people were really worried, nervous. What do we have to do? Do we have to change our trainings that we use for employees? This is a huge part of what we are as an institution. Do we have to stop training students on cultural competency? And at the time we said, no, don't get too far ahead of yourself. We think this is probably going to go away. It might even be unconstitutional. Don't get too far ahead of yourself on that. But I will give you the same warning in the opposite direction now that we have this order from the Biden administration, because although this does rescind everything that the Trump administration initially said in their executive order, there was one little piece of that Trump executive order that I found the most interesting, which was it involved Title VII lawsuits. And encouraging the federal government to take a position in cases where, let's say, a Caucasian male filed a lawsuit against his employer, alleging that the use of certain types of equity trainings was actually discrimination or harassment against him based on his race or gender or sex. And what the executive order from the Trump administration said is, hey, federal government, we want you to write briefs and encourage and take the side of plaintiffs who might be making those types of complaints. Now, obviously, the Biden administration's decision here, it's taking that directive away from the federal government. The federal government is not going to be lining up at the courthouse to write amicus briefs on behalf of white cisgender male plaintiffs who are filing lawsuits about equity trainings. However, those individuals still have their private right to file those types of lawsuits, and we have no idea what courts are going to say about them, because it's not really, it's very uncharted territory. So that is not to say that you shouldn't continue doing your equity trainings. You should. We do them at Franczek. You know, we recognize how fundamental and important they are. It just means to keep in mind that you want to make sure that you're working with your legal team to craft those types of things so that you are kind of making sure you're protecting yourself as much as possible while you're doing them. So keep doing them, keep doing the good work, but don't take this as a completely free pass to remove our phone numbers from your speed dial when you are working on those types. All right, Amy, let's talk for a minute about the Violence Against Women Act. So for anyone who is not familiar, that is a federal law, really a landmark piece of legislation that sought to improve criminal, legal, and community-based responses, including school responses to things like domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. And we often think about that law in terms of its requirement on higher education institutions with respect to responses of sexual violence. But we know it's up for reauthorization. And Amy, what do we know about Biden's perspective on the reauthorization of VAWA and how it might impact not just colleges and universities, but even K-12 schools?
Yeah. So, you know, we saw that one of the key priorities identified by President Biden when he was campaigning you know, was addressing issues of violence against women, with a top priority of getting legislation passed to reauthorize the Violence Against Women's Act, often referred to as VAWA. So VAWA was enacted in 1994 to raise awareness of domestic violence and assault crimes against women. VAWA has been updated and reauthorized several times since then, but especially in 2013, there was a particular focus on higher education institutions. And one of the key amendments relevant to higher education then was the Campus Save provision in VAWA that amended the Clery Act, which requires institutions of higher education to collect and publish information about crimes occurring on campus. So VAWA amended the Clery Act by placing new requirements on schools, higher education institutions specifically, about what information is required to be reported and how to report, as well as to provide educational programming on sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking, and have written procedures and methods for reporting and addressing reports of sexual violence on campus. Now, President Biden sponsored VAWA when it passed in 1994 and played a key role in its reauthorization in 2013. So it is no surprise that he has identified this as a priority. And he has also identified in campaign materials many other goals addressing issues of sexual violence, including on the K-12 and higher education level. So the reauthorization of VAWA might just be one mechanism for putting into place those initiatives, in addition to other legislative initiatives that we might see. So the current status, in April 2019, the House of Representatives voted to pass the VAWA Reauthorization Act of 2019, which would reauthorize VAWA for 5 years, reauthorize funding for VAWA grant programs, and authorizing new ones, including, among others, supporting training and early childhood education programs, and improve campus grant programs to expand training and programming, as well as additional changes related to data collection, law enforcement training and approaches, tribal jurisdiction, and gun possession, among other areas. That was passed in the House of Representatives, but that bill or a similar bill has yet to be passed in the Senate. So given that when campaigning, this was something that President Biden said at the time, that if the Senate didn't take action, that this was going to be a focus in his first 100 days. So this will be an area to watch, including what, if any, additional provisions might be proposed to be included in the reauthorization beyond just what was in the House version. And then if there are additional provisions, what does that mean for higher education institutions as well as K through 12 institutions? So that'll be an area for us to watch. We anticipate it happening, but there's still a little bit of tea leaves there in terms of the approach. So, I think we've looked at all the clearest tea leaves that we can, that we've talked about today, but with the time we have left, Jackie, is there anything else that is on the horizon or top of mind in terms of what we're expecting for Title IX, even if it hasn't happened yet?
Yeah, I think we are expecting to see changes to the regulations. We've been saying that for months. We're going to keep saying it. We still don't know what it's going to look like. We talked a little bit earlier about that there's a push from some of the major organizations to try to make this a little bit more solid by going the legislative route. The upside of that is that it gives us more stability. The downside is that it takes more time. So we aren't totally sure right now. You should continue to stay the course with respect to Title IX. You should continue with your training. You should continue making sure that your policies, your procedures, and your websites are up to date. You should continue by making sure that you're processing any complaints the way that they should be. And yes, we will cover you. We had a question in the chat. Do we plan to do similar coverage? We will continue doing these meetings once a month. We will continue to update you on whatever we learn, and we will be providing, once a law is passed or regulations are changed, we will be there with whatever training you need to make sure that you get into compliance, just as we were last year. I am still hopeful, and again, am using whatever limited ability I have to try to influence the process. My number one goal is consistency for all of you, because although there are lots of things that we would like to see changed about these regulations, we don't want you to have to go through what you went through last year again in 2022 with something completely different. So we will continue to keep you updated, and please, if you are registered for this session, you are registered. It's an ongoing Zoom invite, so you will be registered going forward. You should receive reminder emails the day before each of these team meetups, as well as shortly before each day. So keep an eye out for those. If you have questions, I will put in the chat. Please send them to title9@franczek.com. We do use your questions in preparing for these sessions. We also, if we get enough interest in particular topics, we may offer longer webinars on topics. So please keep the questions coming, and don't hesitate to reach out to any one of us if we can assist you if you're facing any on the ground questions within your school or district. All right, thank you everyone. Thanks to the panelists for joining, and thanks for everyone in the audience for joining as well. And we will look forward to seeing you on the first Tuesday in March, which is the 2nd again. So we will see you then. Thank you everyone. Have a great day.